The bitter wind howled across the Montana territory as Yates Sutherland's gaze swept over the darkening horizon, his weathered hand instinctively tightening around the reins of his horse. Winter had descended on Kingston with merciless force in December of 1873, bringing with it the kind of cold that seeped into a man's bones and settled there like an unwelcome guest. "Come on, Daisy," he murmured to his mare, who snorted a cloud of vapor into the frigid air. "Just a few more miles and we'll both be warm." At 32, Yates had spent more than a decade carving out his existence on this unforgiving land. The Rocking S Ranch represented everything he had in the world: 300 acres of tough Montana soil that had tested his resolve every day since he'd claimed it. His cattle were thin but healthy, his cabin solid if modest, and his reputation as a fair man had spread throughout the county. It wasn't much compared to the sprawling operations of the cattle barons further east, but it was his, paid for with sweat and determination. The snowflakes began to fall more heavily as dusk approached, the temperature dropping with alarming speed. Yates had made the journey into Kingston for supplies, never expecting the sudden turn in weather. The saddlebags behind him were filled with the necessities that would see him through another week: coffee, flour, sugar, ammunition, and a few precious letters from his sister back in Pennsylvania. He squinted through the thickening snow, relief washing over him as the silhouette of his cabin appeared in the distance. The prospect of a warm fire and hot coffee spurred both him and Daisy forward, their pace quickening despite the treacherous footing. It was then that he saw a dark shape huddled against the trunk of a cottonwood tree near the creek that bordered his property. At first he thought it might be a wounded animal or perhaps a trick of the fading light, but as he drew closer, the shape took human form. "Hello there," he called out, his voice carried away by the wind. The figure didn't respond, didn't even move. Concern overrode caution as Yates dismounted, his boots crunching in the fresh snow as he approached. It was a woman, he realized, her form curled tightly around itself in a desperate attempt to preserve warmth. Her long black hair spilled from beneath a thin shawl that provided little protection against the elements, and her dress, though beautifully decorated with intricate beadwork, was woefully inadequate for the Montana winter. "Madam." Yates knelt beside her, noting the distinctive patterns of her clothing that marked her as Apache. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, dark, intelligent eyes that regarded him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Her lips moved, but the words were too soft to hear. "You'll freeze to death out here," he said, his decision made in an instant. "I'm going to take you to my cabin. It's not far." She shook her head weakly, attempting to speak again. This time he caught a few words in halting English. "No, cannot. My people." "Your people would want you alive," Yates insisted, already shrugging out of his heavy coat to wrap around her shoulders. "Whatever brought you here can wait until this storm passes." He helped her to her feet, surprised by how light she felt despite her tall frame. She swayed dangerously, and he steadied her with a firm but gentle hand. "I'm Yates Sutherland," he said, guiding her toward Daisy. "This is my land you're on, but you're welcome to shelter until you're strong enough to continue your journey." "Ehawee," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Ehawee tall pine." Yates nodded, lifting her onto his horse before mounting behind her. He could feel her shivering violently against him as they made their way to the cabin, her body radiating a dangerous cold that told him how close she had come to succumbing to the elements. The cabin appeared before them like a beacon, smoke still rising from the chimney thanks to the banked fire he'd left that morning. He helped Ehawee down and half carried her inside, where the relative warmth enveloped them immediately. "Let me build this up," he said, moving to the fireplace and adding several logs from the stack nearby. The flames caught quickly, casting flickering light across the simple but neat interior. A table with 2 chairs, a cupboard filled with mismatched dishes, a narrow bed in the corner, and a bearskin rug on the plank floor. It wasn't much, but it was dry and warm. Ehawee stood near the door, swaying slightly, her dark eyes taking in every detail of his home. The coat he'd given her engulfed her frame, making her appear smaller than she was. "Sit," Yates gestured to one of the chairs. "I'll make some coffee to warm you up." She hesitated before complying, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to flee at any moment. "Thank you," she said, her English clearer now. "The storm, it came so quickly." "Montana weather," Yates agreed, hanging a pot of water over the fire. "Can catch even those who have lived here their whole lives off guard. Were you traveling alone?" A shadow passed over Ehawee's face. "No. My sisters and I, we were separated. We sought shelter from the storm in different directions." Yates frowned. "There are more of your people out in this, too," she confirmed. "My sisters, Kimimla and Nahimana, we were returning to our winter camp when the blizzard descended." "In the morning, I'll help you look for them," Yates promised. "But tonight, that storm would claim anyone foolish enough to venture out. Your best hope is that they found shelter as you did." Ehawee nodded, though worry remained etched in her features. "They are strong, my sisters, skilled in the ways of survival." As the water began to boil, Yates measured coffee grounds into the pot. The rich aroma soon filled the cabin, bringing a sense of normalcy to the unusual situation. He poured the steaming liquid into 2 cups, offering one to Ehawee. "Drink," he encouraged. "It will help." She accepted the cup with both hands, inhaling the fragrant steam before taking a cautious sip. A small smile touched her lips, the first expression beyond wariness he had seen from her. "It is good," she said. "Thank you, Yates Sutherland." "Just Yates," he replied, settling into the other chair. "May I ask what brings Apache people so far north? I thought your territories were mostly to the south." Ehawee regarded him over the rim of her cup, considering her answer. "Our band has always traveled farther than others. We trade with many tribes, Crow, Blackfoot, even some Lakota. This season, we came to exchange woven blankets for furs." "Dangerous journey," Yates observed, "especially with tensions being what they are." "All journeys have danger," she replied simply. "But there is respect between those who understand the land. It is only with the white settlers that blood seems to flow too readily." Yates couldn't argue with the truth in her words. The history between white settlers and the indigenous peoples of the territories was written in violence and broken promises. He was one of the lucky ones. His small ranch existed in relative peace with the neighboring tribes, largely because he kept to himself and treated those he encountered with respect. "You should rest," he said, noticing how her eyelids had begun to droop. "You can take the bed." "I'll sleep by the fire." Ehawee shook her head. "I cannot take your bed." "You can and you will," Yates insisted. "No offense meant, but you look about ready to topple over, and the floor won't do you any favors." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, fatigue clearly winning out over pride. Yates turned his back to offer privacy as she removed his coat and her outer garments. When he heard the creak of the bed frame, he turned to find her already burrowed beneath the single woolen blanket he owned, her eyes closed. Even in the dim light, he could see she was beautiful, her features strong yet delicate, her skin the color of burnished copper. There was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, despite her current vulnerability. Yates added another log to the fire before stretching out on the bearskin rug, his saddle serving as a pillow. Outside, the wind continued its mournful howl, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the cabin walls. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of Ehawee's sisters, and he hoped they had found shelter from the merciless storm. In the deep of night, Yates awoke to the sound of chattering teeth. The fire had burned low, casting only a faint glow across the cabin. He sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and saw Ehawee shivering violently beneath his thin blanket. Without hesitation, he rose and stoked the fire, adding several large logs to build it back to a roaring blaze. Then he approached the bed. "Ehawee," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "You're cold." Her eyes opened, dark pools reflecting the firelight. "I am sorry to wake you," she whispered. "The cold. It settled in my bones during the storm. I cannot seem to chase it away." Yates glanced around the cabin, searching for something that might help. His gaze landed on his coat, but it was still damp from the snow. His extra shirts were too thin to offer much warmth. "Wait here," he said unnecessarily. Where would she go? And stepped outside onto the porch. The storm had intensified, snow swirling in thick curtains that obscured everything beyond a few feet. In the lean-to attached to the cabin, he felt his way to where his horse blankets hung. They weren't ideal, but they were dry. He selected the cleanest one and hurried back inside, shaking off snow as he entered. "It's not fancy," he said, approaching the bed, "but it's warm." Ehawee watched as he unfolded the rough horse blanket and laid it over her. "Your last blanket," she observed. "What will you use?" "I'll be fine by the fire," he assured her. "I've slept in worse conditions during roundups." She studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for deceit. Finding none, she nodded. "Your kindness will not be forgotten, Yates Sutherland." "Get some sleep," he said, slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Morning will be here before you know it, and we'll need to look for your sisters." Returning to his place by the fire, Yates found sleep elusive. His thoughts kept returning to the woman in his bed, and the strange circumstances that had brought her to his land. In all his years in Kingston, he had encountered various indigenous peoples, mostly Crow and Blackfoot, whose territories overlapped this region but never Apache. Their presence this far north was unusual enough to pique his curiosity. When morning finally arrived, it brought with it a startling clarity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white that sparkled beneath a brilliant blue sky. Yates was already up, frying bacon and brewing coffee when Ehawee stirred. She rose with a fluid grace, the horse blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she approached the fire. "The storm has passed," she observed, glancing toward the window where sunlight streamed in. "Yes, but it left nearly 2 feet of snow behind," Yates replied, sliding a plate of bacon and pan bread toward her. "Eat something before we head out. We'll need the strength." Ehawee accepted the food with a nod of thanks. "My sisters will be looking for me as well. We had arranged to meet at the fork in the creek if we became separated." "That's about 3 miles from here," Yates said, familiar with every inch of the surrounding terrain. "We can start there." They ate in companionable silence, and Yates found himself studying Ehawee when she wasn't looking. In the daylight, he could see that she was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25 or so. Her movements were deliberate and economical, her posture straight despite the previous day's ordeal. After breakfast, Ehawee donned her now dry clothes, declining Yates's offer of his coat. "The sun will warm the day," she said, "and I am accustomed to the cold." Yates saddled Daisy while Ehawee waited on the porch, her gaze scanning the horizon as if she might spot her sisters from a distance. Once ready, he helped her mount behind him, and they set off toward the creek fork. The journey was slow going, with Daisy laboring through deep snow. Ehawee sat straight behind him, her hands resting lightly on his waist for balance. They spoke little, both scanning the pristine landscape for any sign of other travelers. As they approached the creek fork, Ehawee suddenly stiffened. "There," she said, pointing toward a stand of pines on the opposite bank. "Smoke." Yates followed her gaze and indeed spotted a thin column of smoke rising above the trees. "Could be your sisters," he agreed, directing Daisy toward the creek crossing. The water was icy but shallow, and Daisy picked her way across carefully. As they approached the pines, Yates heard female voices speaking in a language he didn't understand but recognized as similar to the few Apache words Ehawee had spoken. "Kimimla, Nahimana," Ehawee called out, sliding from the horse before Yates had fully stopped. Two women emerged from the shelter of the pines, their faces lighting with relief and joy at the sight of their sister. They rushed forward, embracing Ehawee in a tangle of arms and excited words. Yates dismounted, keeping a respectful distance as the sisters reunited. The family resemblance was clear. All three women shared the same proud bearing and delicate features, though each was distinctive in her own way. When the initial excitement subsided, Ehawee turned to Yates, switching to English. "My sisters," she said. "Kimimla," she indicated the shorter of the two, whose round face was framed by braids adorned with small shells, "and Nahimana," the taller woman with a serious expression and a thin scar across her right cheek. "This is Yates Sutherland," Ehawee continued. "He saved my life during the storm." Both women regarded him with cautious gratitude. Kimimla stepped forward first, offering a slight bow. "Thank you for protecting our sister," she said, her English more accented than Ehawee's but clear. "I'm glad I found her when I did," Yates replied honestly. Another hour in that cold and things might have ended differently. Nahimana's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what payment did you expect for this? Protection?" "Nahimana," Ehawee admonished, but Yates held up a hand. "It's a fair question," he said, meeting Nahimana's suspicious gaze directly. "I expected nothing then and expect nothing now. Where I come from, you don't let anyone freeze to death if you can help it, man, woman, or child." A tense silence followed until Kimimla broke it with a practical observation. "We have made a small camp, but our supplies are limited. The storm forced us to abandon our pack horse." "Then you'll come back to my cabin," Yates said without hesitation, "at least until you're properly provisioned for your journey." The sisters exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Ehawee spoke. "We accept your hospitality, Yates Sutherland, and we will find ways to repay your kindness." "No need," he insisted. "It's not charity, just neighborliness." They gathered the few items the sisters had managed to keep with them: a small cooking pot, a water skin, a knife, and a pouch of dried meat. Yates offered Daisy to the women, opting to lead the horse on foot, but all three declined, preferring to walk alongside him. As they made their way back to his cabin, Yates learned that the sisters were indeed on a trading journey, traveling with a small band of their people who were camped some 50 miles to the south. They had separated from the main group to visit a Crow settlement known for its fine beadwork, planning to rejoin their band before the worst of winter set in. "The storm caught us by surprise," Kimimla explained. "We sought shelter, but the wind changed direction so suddenly." "It happens," Yates assured her. "Even those of us who have lived here for years get caught out sometimes." By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was high overhead, turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of blinding white. Inside, Yates built up the fire again while the sisters arranged themselves around the small table. "I don't have much," he apologized, "but what I have you're welcome to share." Nahimana, who had remained largely silent during the journey, finally spoke. "We will not be a burden. We can hunt, forage, and cook. Our presence will not deplete your stores." "I appreciate that," Yates said, understanding that her offer was as much about maintaining dignity as it was about practical concerns. Game's scarce this time of year, but there are usually rabbits near the south pasture. The day settled into an unexpected rhythm of domestic activity. Kimimla proved to be an excellent cook, transforming Yates's basic provisions into a flavorful stew that filled the cabin with enticing aromas. Nahimana ventured outside with his permission and returned with an armful of firewood she had expertly chopped. And Ehawee, after resting, began to repair a tear in one of his shirts with such fine stitching that it disappeared almost entirely. As they sat down to the evening meal, Yates found himself more relaxed than he had been in months. The cabin, usually so quiet save for the occasional crackling of the fire, was filled with the soft murmur of conversation as the sisters spoke to each other in their native tongue, interspersed with English when including him. "How long have you lived here alone?" Ehawee asked as they ate. "Going on 12 years, Yates replied. "Came west after the war, worked as a ranch hand for a while before staking my claim on this land." "No wife?" Kimimla asked with innocent curiosity, earning a sharp look from Nahimana. Yates shook his head. "Never seemed to be the right time or the right person. Ranching doesn't leave much opportunity for courting. Our father used to say that the heart finds its match when it is ready, not when it is convenient," Ehawee said with a small smile. "Perhaps your heart is not yet ready." Something in her expression, a mixture of wisdom and gentle teasing, caught Yates off guard. He found himself noticing the way the firelight played across her features, highlighting the elegant line of her cheekbones and the warmth in her eyes. Clearing his throat, he turned the conversation to more practical matters. "How long will you stay in the territory before heading back to your people?" "We had planned to remain through the winter moon," Nahimana answered. "The trading was good, and we have many items to bring back to our band. But without our pack horse and supplies." "I can help with that," Yates offered. "I have a mule I use for hauling that you're welcome to borrow, and I can spare some provisions." "Why would you do this?" Nahimana asked bluntly. "You do not know us." "I know enough," Yates replied, equally direct. "And out here, people help each other. That's how we survive." The discussion continued as they finished their meal and cleaned up. Sleeping arrangements presented a challenge. The cabin had been built for one man, not 4 people. Yates insisted the sisters take the bed, which was just wide enough for the 3 of them if they lay close together. He would again sleep on the bearskin rug by the fire. As darkness fell, the sisters retired to the bed while Yates banked the fire for the night. He was just settling onto his makeshift bedding when Ehawee's voice reached him through the dimness. "You are a good man, Yates Sutherland. There are not many who would open their home to strangers, especially those with skin different from their own." "I judge people by their actions, not their appearance," he replied. "Always have." "A rare quality," she murmured. "Sleep well." "You too, Ehawee." But sleep proved elusive for Yates. The presence of the 3 women in his cabin, particularly Ehawee, had stirred something in him that he'd thought long dormant. An awareness, a consciousness of his own solitude that he usually managed to ignore. The soft sound of their breathing, the subtle scent of sage that seemed to cling to Ehawee's hair, the way she looked at him with those perceptive eyes, all of it created a disquiet in his soul that was both uncomfortable and strangely welcome. Morning brought a flurry of activity. The sisters rose early, and by the time Yates awoke, breakfast was already cooking. Kimimla had found his small cache of dried berries and added them to the pan bread, giving it a sweetness he hadn't tasted in months. "We will go to the creek today," Ehawee announced as they ate. "Our clothes need washing and we must perform our morning prayers." Yates nodded. "I need to check on my cattle anyway. The north pasture has a sheltered area where they usually gather during storms. The day passed quickly, each of them attending to their respective tasks. When Yates returned from checking his herd all present and accounted for, though looking reproachfully at him for the delay in their feed, he found the cabin transformed. The sisters had swept, dusted, and rearranged his meager furnishings to create a more harmonious space. A bouquet of dried prairie grass and pine needles sat on the table, giving the room a fresh scent. "You didn't need to do all this," he said, both pleased and slightly embarrassed by their efforts. "It is little enough in return for your hospitality," Ehawee replied, hanging a freshly washed shirt near the fire to dry. That evening, as they again gathered around the table for supper, the conversation flowed more easily. Kimimla shared stories of their childhood, of summers spent following the buffalo herds and winters huddled in sheltered valleys. Nahimana, who had gradually warmed to Yates, spoke of their father, a respected medicine man who had taught them the healing properties of various plants. And Ehawee, seated closest to Yates, occasionally translated phrases or explained cultural references. Each time she leaned toward him, he caught the scent of her hair, clean and somehow reminiscent of sunlit meadows despite the winter season. "Tomorrow," Nahimana said as they finished eating, "we should prepare to continue our journey. The snow is already beginning to compress, and travel will be possible soon." A strange disappointment settled in Yates's chest at the thought of their departure. "You're welcome to stay longer," he found himself saying, "at least until the trails are properly cleared." "We have already imposed too much," Nahimana began, but Ehawee interrupted her. "Perhaps a few more days would be wise," she suggested. "We need to properly prepare, and Yates has offered his mule. We should learn its temperament before setting out." Nahimana seemed about to object further but subsided with a thoughtful look between Ehawee and Yates. "Very well," she agreed finally. "A few more days." That night, as they settled into their now established sleeping arrangements, Yates found himself wide awake, staring at the cabin ceiling. The prospect of the sisters' departure, of Ehawee's departure, left him with an unexpected hollowness. In just 2 days, their presence had filled a void in his life he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. A soft rustling sound drew his attention, and he turned to see Ehawee rising from the bed. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb her sleeping sisters, and approached the fire. Without a word, she settled onto the edge of the bearskin rug, just beyond arm's reach from Yates. "You should be sleeping," he whispered. "As should you," she returned with a gentle smile. "Yet here we both are, awake in the quiet hours. What keeps you from sleep?" he asked. Ehawee gazed into the glowing embers for a long moment before answering. "Thoughts of the path ahead, and of the kindness I have found where I least expected it." "I've done nothing special," Yates insisted. "Have you not?" Her eyes met his across the dim space between them. "You gave shelter to a stranger, shared your food and home with people many of your kind would drive away with rifles raised. You offered your last blanket to keep me warm. Anyone would have done the same." "No, Yates Sutherland," she said softly. "Not anyone. I have traveled enough to know that your heart is rare." Something in her tone, a warmth, an intimacy, sent a jolt through him. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. "Your sisters will wonder where you are," he managed to say. "My sisters know my mind better than I do sometimes," Ehawee replied enigmatically. She rose with fluid grace. "Sleep well, Yates." As she returned to the bed, Yates was left with the distinct impression that something significant had passed between them, though he couldn't have named it if asked. The next day brought unexpected challenges. A Chinook wind swept down from the mountains, rapidly melting the snow and turning the ground to mud. While this would eventually make travel easier, the immediate effect was to create treacherous conditions and rising creek levels. "The melt will flood the lower creek crossings," Yates explained over breakfast. "You'll need to wait until it subsides before attempting the journey south." The sisters accepted this news with varying reactions. Nahimana frowned but nodded in practical acknowledgement of the situation. Jemimah seemed openly pleased at the prospect of extending their stay, and Ehawee's expression remained composed, but Yates thought he detected a flicker of something like satisfaction in her eyes. "Then we will make ourselves useful during this time," she declared. "Nahimana is skilled with leather work. Perhaps there are repairs needed for your saddle or tack. Jemimah can continue to help with cooking and gathering, and Ehawee is the best storyteller among our people," Jemimah interjected enthusiastically. "She knows the old tales better than anyone, even our elders." A faint blush colored Ehawee's cheeks. "I merely remember what I have been taught," she said modestly. "I'd like to hear your stories," Yates said sincerely. "Winter evenings get long out here with only my own thoughts for company." And so began a new rhythm to their days. Mornings were spent on practical tasks, Yates tending to his cattle and property, the sisters helping where they could and attending to their own needs. Afternoons often found them working together, with Yates showing them aspects of ranching life while they shared their own skills and knowledge. Ehawee proved to have a natural affinity for horses, approaching Daisy with a quiet confidence that the sometimes temperamental mare responded to immediately. She helped Yates mend fences damaged by the winter storms, her slender hands surprisingly strong as she held posts steady while he hammered them into place. Jemimah's talents in the kitchen continued to transform Yates's basic provisions into meals that made the cabin fragrant with unfamiliar but delicious aromas. And Nahimana, despite her initial reserve, began to share her extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, identifying several growing on Yates's property that could be used for various ailments. In the evenings, they gathered around the fire, and Ehawee would weave tales of her people creation stories, trickster legends, accounts of brave warriors and wise women. Her voice took on a mesmerizing quality as she spoke, painting vivid images with her words that transported Yates to distant landscapes and ancient times. On the fourth night, as a light rain pattered against the cabin roof, Ehawee told the story of the first meeting between her people and the Spanish explorers. Her narrative was balanced, acknowledging both the wonder of that encounter and the tragedy that followed as diseases and conflicts decimated indigenous populations. "Your English is exceptional," Yates observed when she finished. "All three of you speak it so well." "Our father believed in preparation," Nahimana explained. "He saw early that the world was changing. He insisted we learn the white man's tongue so we could navigate between worlds. He sent us to a mission school for 2 winters, Jemimah added. It was difficult, but we learned much." "Not all of it good," Nahimana muttered. A shadow passed over Ehawee's face. The missionaries meant well in their way, but they did not understand that one can embrace new knowledge without abandoning the old ways. "That's true of many white settlers," Yates acknowledged. "There's a tendency to think our way is the only way or at least the best way. It's short-sighted." "You are different," Ehawee said, her gaze holding his. "You listen, you consider." "I've had time to think out here," Yates replied. "And I've seen enough to know that wisdom doesn't belong to any one people." As the days passed, Yates found himself increasingly drawn to Ehawee. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was her quiet strength, her thoughtfulness, the way she observed the world with keen intelligence. They began to seek each other's company, finding small tasks that required them to work together while her sisters attended to other matters. During one such moment, as they repaired a broken shutter on the west side of the cabin, Ehawee asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "Why do you live alone, Yates?" Truly, he paused, considering how to answer. "After the war," he began slowly, "I couldn't settle back into town life. Too many memories, too much noise in my head. Out here, things are simpler, clear." "But humans are not meant to be alone," she pressed gently. "We are creatures of community." "I manage," he said with a shrug. "And I'm not completely isolated. I go into Kingston for supplies, exchange news with other ranchers when our paths cross." "That is not the same as having someone who knows your heart," Ehawee observed. "Someone who sees you truly." The directness of her gaze made him uncomfortable, as if she could indeed see beyond his carefully maintained exterior to the loneliness he rarely acknowledged even to himself. "What about you?" he deflected. "You're of an age when most women are already married with children." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "My people do not rush such things. Marriage is a serious bond not to be entered lightly. I have had opportunities, but I have not yet met a man whose spirit speaks to mine in the right way." "And what would that sound like?" Yates asked, genuinely curious. "This spiritual conversation." Ehawee's smile deepened. "It is not words that pass between compatible spirits, Yates Sutherland. It is understanding, recognition, a sense of having known each other before, perhaps in another life." There was something in her tone, a hint, an invitation that made Yates's heart beat faster. Before he could respond, however, Kimimla called from the cabin door that the midday meal was ready. The moment passed, but its effect lingered. Throughout the afternoon, Yates found himself watching Ehawee, noticing small details he had overlooked before: the graceful movement of her hands as she worked, the musical quality of her laughter when Kimimla shared a joke, the thoughtful tilt of her head when she listened to others speak. That evening, after supper, Nahimana announced that the creek levels had begun to recede. "If the weather holds, we should be able to travel in 2 days' time," she said, her tone making it clear that she considered their extended stay to have reached its natural conclusion. "Of course," Yates agreed, though a heaviness settled in his chest at the thought. "I'll make sure the mule is properly prepared for the journey." Later, as the sisters prepared for bed, Ehawee lingered by the fire where Yates sat mending a bridle strap. "My sister is eager to return to our people," she said quietly. "I understand," Yates replied, keeping his eyes on his work. "You've been away longer than planned." "Yes," Ehawee agreed, "but not all journeys follow the expected path. Sometimes delays have purpose." He looked up then, meeting her gaze. "What purpose do you see in this delay?" "Ehawee," she held his eyes for a long moment. "Perhaps it is for me to discover something I did not know I was seeking." Before Yates could ask what she meant, Nahimana called her name from the bed, and the moment was lost again. The next day dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the sisters to prepare for their departure. Yates busied himself with ranch chores, trying to ignore the growing sense of loss that accompanied the thought of Ehawee leaving. It was foolish, he told himself sternly. She had her own people, her own life. Their paths had crossed briefly, nothing more. Yet when he returned to the cabin at midday and found Ehawee alone, Nahimana and Kimimla having gone to the creek to wash their travel clothes, he couldn't deny the leap of his heart at the sight of her. She sat at the table, sewing beads onto a small leather pouch with precise, delicate stitches. She looked up as he entered, a smile warming her features. "I am making you a medicine bag," she explained, holding up the partially completed pouch. "To thank you for your kindness." "You don't need to give me anything," Yates protested, even as he moved closer to examine her handiwork. The design was intricate, a stylized eagle in flight, rendered in tiny blue and white beads against the golden leather. "It is our way," Ehawee insisted. "Gifts create bonds between people. They carry meaning." Yates sat across from her, watching her nimble fingers resume their work. "What meaning does this particular gift carry?" he asked. Ehawee's eyes remained on her stitching, but a small smile played at her lips. "The eagle represents vision, courage, and wisdom. It flies between the earthly realm and the spirit world, carrying messages. This bag will hold protective medicines and remind you that there are those who wish you well, even when they are not present." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched him deeply. "I'll treasure it," he promised. "There is something I wish to ask you," Ehawee said after a moment, her tone becoming more serious. "Something I have been considering since we arrived here." "What is it?" She set down her sewing and met his gaze directly. "Among my people, when a woman finds a man whose spirit speaks to hers, she may propose a courtship period. A time of learning, of determining if their paths should join permanently." Yates's heart began to race, but he kept his expression neutral. "That seems sensible." "I believe," Ehawee continued, her voice steady despite the faint color rising in her cheeks, "that your spirit speaks to mine, Yates Sutherland. I would like to propose such a courtship." For a moment, Yates couldn't speak, stunned by her directness and the implications of her words. "Ehawee," he finally managed, "I'm honored. Truly. But our lives are so different. Your people, my people, have always valued courage and truth above comfort," she interrupted. "I am not proposing to abandon my heritage or asking you to abandon yours. I am suggesting that we explore what exists between us to see if a shared path is possible." "What would that look like?" Yates asked, his mind racing with both possibilities and obstacles. "I would return with my sisters as planned," Ehawee explained. "Our band will winter in the sheltered valley 50 miles south of here. In the spring, when travel is easier, I would come back with my family's blessing to spend time here, to learn your ways as you would learn mine. If, after a season, we both feel that our spirits are truly aligned, we would discuss more permanent arrangements." It was so practical, so reasonable, and yet so radical that Yates found himself momentarily at a loss. The prospect of Ehawee returning in the spring, of having months to explore the connection he already felt growing between them, filled him with unexpected joy. But the realist in him couldn't ignore the challenges such a relationship would face. "People would talk," he said finally. "Both your people and mine. People always talk," Ehawee replied with a dismissive gesture. "It is what they do when they lack the courage to live authentically. The question is not what others would say, but what you feel." "I feel." Yates paused, searching for the right words. "I feel as though something important began the moment I found you beneath that tree. Something I didn't know I was missing until it appeared." A radiant smile transformed Ehawee's face. "Then we are in agreement." "Your sisters know my heart," she assured him. "Nahimana may seem stern, but she wants my happiness. And Kimimla has been watching us with the eyes of a matchmaker since our second day here." Yates couldn't help but laugh at that. "I thought I noticed her finding excuses to leave us alone together." "She is not subtle," Ehawee agreed with affectionate exasperation. "But her intentions are good." They talked for over an hour, discussing practical considerations and addressing potential challenges. By the time Nahimana and Kimimla returned, a tentative plan had been established. Ehawee would return with her sisters to their winter camp. But when the spring thaw came, she would journey back to Kingston properly escorted by family members to begin a formal courtship with Yates. That evening, when Ehawee shared their intentions with her sisters, the reactions were as expected. Kimimla clapped her hands in delight. immediately peppering them both with questions about wedding plans that were far premature. Nahimana's response was more measured concern in her eyes but acceptance in her nod. "Our father would say that the heart knows its own path," she said finally. "If this is truly your desire, Ehawee, I will support you. But," she added, fixing Yates with a penetrating stare, "know that our sister is precious to us. Her happiness is not a small thing." "I understand," Yates replied solemnly. "And I give you my word that her well-being will always be my highest concern." The final day of the sisters' stay was filled with preparation and promise. Yates prepared the mule as promised, packing it with supplies for their journey: food, blankets, and a small tent he had used during cattle drives. He also provided a detailed map of the safest route south, marking reliable water sources and areas where shelter could be found if needed. In turn, the sisters left him with gifts: a pair of beautifully beaded moccasins from Kimimla, a pouch of healing herbs from Nahimana, and from Ehawee, the completed medicine bag, now filled with sacred items she had carefully selected and blessed. "To protect you until I return," she said as she hung it around his neck, her fingers lingering against his chest. "Wear it close to your heart." Their parting was bittersweet. As the sisters mounted their horses, Nahimana on Yates's mule, Kimimla and Ehawee sharing a mare they had brought with them, there were no tearful goodbyes, only confident promises of reunion. "The dogwood will be blooming when I return," Ehawee said, her eyes holding Yates's. "Listen for my approach with your spirit and you will know the day before I arrive." Yates nodded, words suddenly difficult to find. "I'll be waiting," he managed finally. "Safe journey." He watched until they disappeared from sight, three figures growing smaller against the vast landscape. The cabin seemed unnaturally quiet when he returned to it, the absence of the sisters, particularly Ehawee, a tangible presence in itself. Winter settled into its rhythm again. Yates tended his cattle, repaired storm damage to his outbuildings, and made occasional trips into Kingston for supplies. But something had fundamentally changed. Where before he had been content in his solitude, now he felt the sharp edge of loneliness. The medicine bag Ehawee had given him became a talisman, something he touched frequently throughout the day, drawing comfort from its connection to her. In town, he found himself seeking out the company of others more than usual. He struck up conversations with the storekeeper, accepted invitations to Sunday dinners from neighbors he had previously kept at a polite distance, and even attended a community dance at the newly built schoolhouse. This shift did not go unnoticed. Martha Wilkins, the postmaster's wife and Kingston's unofficial social coordinator, commented on it one afternoon as Yates purchased supplies at the general store. "You're looking more cheerful these days, Mr. Sutherland," she observed. "Must be the approaching spring putting a bounce in your step." Yates smiled noncommittally. "Just glad to see the back of winter, Mrs. Wilkins." She replied, clearly unconvinced. Her eyes dropped to the medicine bag visible at the collar of his shirt. "That's a fine piece of Indian craftsmanship you're wearing. Don't believe I've seen it before." "It was a gift," Yates said simply, not elaborating. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "A gift, is it? Well now, gifts from certain quarters can lead to interesting developments, I've always found." Yates paid for his purchases and bid her good day, aware that speculation would follow. Kingston was small enough that any change in routine was noted and discussed. His sudden sociability, combined with the obviously Native American craftsmanship of Ehawee's gift, would provide ample fodder for local gossip. Strangely, he found he didn't much care. The opinions of Kingston's citizens seemed less important than they once had. What mattered was the promise of Ehawee's return, the possibility of a future different from the lonely existence he had settled for. As winter reluctantly released its grip on the land, Yates began to prepare for Ehawee's arrival. He expanded his garden plot, planting vegetables that would mature throughout the summer. He added a lean-to room to the cabin, providing additional living space and privacy. He even purchased fabric in town-rich blues and deep reds that reminded him of the beadwork on Ehawee's dress, with the vague idea that she might want to make curtains or cushion covers. Martha Wilkins noticed these purchases too, of course. "Planning some home improvements, Mr. Sutherland?" she inquired, measuring out the yards of fabric he'd requested. "Just freshening things up for spring," he replied with studied casualness. "Indeed," she said, her tone making it clear she suspected there was more to the story. "Well, if you're in need of a woman's touch for those curtains you're planning, my niece Emily is quite handy with a needle. Pretty girl, too, just turned 19 last month. Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins, but I believe I have the necessary arrangements in hand," Yates said firmly, putting an end to her matchmaking efforts. As April turned to May, the dogwoods indeed began to bloom, their white flowers standing out against the greening landscape like scattered snow. Yates found himself watching the southern horizon whenever his chores took him to elevated parts of his property, though he knew it was still early for Ehawee's return. Then, on a warm evening in late May, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, a strange certainty settled over him. She was coming. Not today, but soon, perhaps tomorrow or the next day. The feeling was so strong that he spent the following morning preparing the cabin, sweeping the floors, airing out bedding, and arranging wildflowers in a tin cup on the table. Just after midday, as he worked in the garden, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached his ears. He straightened, shading his eyes against the sun as he peered down the trail leading to his property. A small party of riders approached 4 or 5 figures on horseback, moving at a steady pace. His heart raced as he recognized Ehawee at the lead, her straight posture and fluid movement unmistakable even at a distance. Behind her rode Kimimla and Nahimana, flanking an older man whose dignified bearing marked him as someone of importance. A fifth rider, a young man perhaps in his early 20s, brought up the rear. Yates walked to meet them, trying to maintain a composed exterior despite the joy surging through him at the sight of Ehawee. As they drew closer, he could see her face, her eyes finding his, a smile blooming across her features that matched the warmth spreading through his chest. She reined her horse to a stop a few paces from him and dismounted with graceful ease. For a moment, they simply stood looking at each other, months of separation falling away in an instant of recognition. "Yates Sutherland," she said, her voice carrying the same musical quality he had remembered in his dreams. "My spirit told me you would be waiting." "Ehawee," he replied, unable to suppress his smile. "Your spirit was right." She turned to gesture toward the older man, who was now dismounting with the assistance of the young warrior. "My father, Chief Tall Pine, he wished to meet the man who saved his daughter's life and now seeks her heart." The older man approached with deliberate steps. Though age had lined his face and streaked his long hair with gray, his eyes were sharp and evaluating as they took in Yates's appearance, his home, his land. "Chief Tall Pine," Yates greeted him respectfully, extending his hand in the white man's custom while inclining his head in deference to the chief's status. The older man studied him for a long moment before accepting the handshake. "My daughters have told me much about you, Yates Sutherland," he said, his English clear and formal. "They say you are a man of honor who respects the old ways while living in the new world." "I try to be," Yates replied honestly. Your daughters honor me with such a description." Chief Tall Pine nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. "We have traveled far to see if what Ehawee believes is true, that your spirit and hers are meant to walk the same path. I am here to witness, to judge, and if it is right, to give my blessing." The directness of his statement was both intimidating and refreshing. There would be no games, no hidden agendas in this courtship evaluation. "I welcome your judgment," Yates said, "and I hope to prove worthy of your daughter's regard." The chief's stern expression softened slightly. "A good answer. Now, perhaps you can offer weary travelers water and shade before we speak further." "Of course," Yates gestured toward the cabin. "My home is yours for as long as you wish to stay." As the party dismounted and began to unpack their horses, Ehawee moved to Yates's side. Out of sight of the others, her fingers briefly touched his, a whisper of contact that sent electricity through him. "I have thought of this moment every day," she said softly. "The reality is better than my imagination." "For me as well," Yates admitted, fighting the urge to take her hand properly. "I've missed you, Ehawee, more than I thought possible." Her eyes, warm and understanding, held his. "Then let us show my father that what exists between us is true and strong. He is fair, but he will need to be convinced that this path is right for both of us." The days that followed took on a pattern of cultural exchange and evaluation. Chief Tall Pine observed Yates carefully, how he managed his ranch, how he interacted with his neighbors when they occasionally stopped by, how he treated Ehawee and her family. The young warrior, who Yates learned was Ehawee's cousin Takoda, was similarly watchful but less intimidating in his scrutiny. For his part, Yates found himself genuinely interested in learning more about Apache customs and beliefs. He listened attentively as Chief Tall Pine shared stories of their people's history, asked thoughtful questions about their spiritual practices, and demonstrated respect for their traditions. Ehawee acted as a bridge between the two worlds, explaining concepts from either culture that might be misunderstood. Her role was crucial, but it also limited the time she and Yates could spend alone together. Their moments of privacy were brief and precious, a few minutes walking to the creek to fetch water, an hour working side by side in the garden while the others rested during the heat of the afternoon. During one such interlude, as they knelt among the young corn plants pulling weeds, Ehawee asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "Are you certain, Yates, certain that this is what you want? My father is watching for any sign of doubt, any hesitation." Yates sat back on his heels, looking at her directly. "I'm certain about you," he said simply. "The rest, the challenges, the adjustments, those we'll figure out together. But my feelings haven't changed, Ehawee. If anything, they've grown stronger in your absence." The worry in her expression eased, replaced by a soft smile. "As have mine. But I needed to hear you say it, to know that you understand what choosing me might mean." "I do understand," he assured her. "It won't always be easy. There will be those who disapprove, who may make life difficult for us at times, but nothing worth having comes without effort." Ehawee's smile widened. "My father says much the same thing. Perhaps you are more alike than either of you realizes." On the 5th day of their visit, Chief Tall Pine requested that Yates accompany him on a ride around the property. They set out in the cool of early morning, the chief riding beside Yates, in contemplative silence as they followed the boundaries of the ranch. Finally, as they paused to let their horses drink from the creek, the older man spoke. "My daughter believes your heart is true. Her sisters agree, though Nahimana took longer to convince." A hint of amusement touched his eyes at this last observation. "And what do you believe, sir?" Yates asked directly. Chief Tall Pine considered the question, his gaze sweeping over the land before returning to Yates's face. "I believe you are a good man who has built a good life here. I believe you respect my daughter for her mind as well as her beauty. These things matter." He paused, and Yates waited, sensing there was more to come. "But I also see the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be," the chief continued. "A union between you and Ehawee would face many challenges. There would be those among your people who would shun you, perhaps even threaten you. And while my band is more accepting of change than most, there would be those among us who would question Ehawee's choice as well." "I've considered these things," Yates acknowledged. "I won't pretend they don't concern me, especially as they might affect Ehawee. But I believe what we could build together would be worth the struggle." Chief Tall Pine nodded slowly. "There is wisdom in recognizing both the cost and the value of a choice." He straightened in his saddle, his decision apparently made. "Tonight, we will have a special meal. If you are still certain after our discussion today, you may ask for my blessing then." "Thank you, sir," Yates said, relief and anticipation mingling in his chest. "I am honored by your consideration." The chief offered a rare smile. "It is a father's duty to ensure his daughter's happiness. Ehawee has always had a spirit that sees beyond the surface of things. If she has chosen you, there must be substance to you that deserves respect." That evening, as promised, a special meal was prepared. Kimimla and Ehawee spent the afternoon cooking, combining traditional Apache dishes with recipes they had learned from Yates during the winter. The result was a feast that symbolized the blending of cultures. They were considering venison stew alongside cornbread, wild berries and honey, beside coffee sweetened with sugar. As they gathered around the table, Chief Tall Pine offered a blessing in his native language, which Ehawee quietly translated for Yates. It was a prayer for wisdom, for clear vision, and for the blessing of the ancestors on the decisions to be made. The meal was filled with storytelling and laughter, tensions easing as the evening progressed. Even Nahimana, who had maintained a certain reserve throughout the visit, joined in more freely, sharing humorous tales of Ehawee's childhood misadventures that made her sister blush and protest good-naturedly. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared away, a moment of expectant silence fell over the group. Chief Tall Pine looked to Yates, a clear invitation in his gaze. Yates took a deep breath and turned to Ehawee, who sat beside him, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something more: hope, affection, a future waiting to unfold. "Ehawee," he began, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart, "since the day you came into my life, something has changed in me. A loneliness I had grown so accustomed to that I barely noticed it anymore has been replaced by a sense of possibility, of purpose beyond just surviving from season to season." He took her hand, aware of the watching eyes of her family but focused entirely on her face. "I don't know all the challenges we'll face, but I know that facing them with you would make even the hardest path worthwhile. If your father gives his blessing, I ask you to join your life with mine not as a guest or a visitor, but as my wife, my partner in all things." Ehawee's eyes shone with emotion as she squeezed his hand. "My spirit recognized yours from our first meeting, Yates Sutherland. I would be honored to walk this path with you, to build a life that honors both our traditions while creating something new between us." They both turned to Chief Tall Pine, whose expression had softened into one of solemn approval. "You have my blessing," he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal declaration. "May your union bring strength to both our peoples and joy to your hearts." A collective breath seemed to be released around the table. Kimimla beamed, clasping her hands in delight. Nahimana offered a small but genuine smile of acceptance. Takoda nodded his approval, raising his cup in a gesture of congratulations. The days that followed were filled with planning and preparation. According to Apache tradition, a proper wedding required certain rituals and the presence of the couple's extended families. It was decided that Ehawee would return to her people's camp with her father and sisters to make these arrangements, while Yates would follow in 2 weeks' time for the ceremony. The night before her departure, Ehawee and Yates walked together under a sky ablaze with stars, savoring their last moments of privacy before the whirlwind of wedding preparations would separate them briefly. "Are you nervous?" Ehawee asked as they paused by the creek, its gentle murmur a counterpoint to the chorus of night insects. "About the ceremony, a little," Yates admitted. "I want to honor your traditions properly. Not just the ceremony," she clarified. "About the life we are choosing, it will not always be easy." Yates turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I'm not naive enough to think it will be without challenges. But when I look at you, when I think of waking up beside you each morning and building a future together, any doubts I might have fade away." Ehawee smiled, the moonlight silvering her features. "It is the same for me. My mother used to say that the right path is rarely the easiest one, but it is always the one that brings the most growth to our spirits." "Your mother sounds wise," Yates said. "I wish I could have met her." "She walks with the ancestors now, but she sees us," Ehawee assured him. "And I believe she approves of my choice." The following morning brought the bittersweet moment of temporary parting. As Ehawee mounted her horse, ready to ride south with her family, she leaned down to Yates, who stood at her stirrup. "2 weeks," she said softly. "It will pass quickly." "Not quickly enough," he replied, reaching up to touch the medicine bag she had given him, which still hung around his neck. "But I'll be there as promised." "I will send Takoda to guide you when it is time," she said. "Until then, listen for me in your dreams." With a final exchange of glances that held more meaning than words could express, the Apache party departed, leaving Yates standing in the yard, watching until they disappeared from sight. The 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Yates traveled into Kingston to order a proper suit for the wedding, ignoring the raised eyebrows and whispered comments that followed his announcement that he was to marry an Apache woman. He purchased a gold band for Ehawee, simple but elegant, and had it engraved with their initials and the date they had first met. Martha Wilkins, predictably, had much to say on the matter. "Well, Mr. Sutherland, this is unexpected news," she commented when he visited the general store to purchase fabric for a wedding gift he planned to give Ehawee. "I suppose there's no accounting for a man's choices when he's been alone too long." "On the contrary, Mrs. Wilkins," Yates replied evenly. "I believe my time alone has given me the clarity to recognize true value when I find it. Ehawee is an extraordinary woman, and I'm fortunate that she's chosen to share her life with mine." Not all reactions were negative. Pastor Thomas, the young minister who had recently arrived to establish Kingston's first proper church, offered sincere congratulations when Yates explained his plans. "Love is God's greatest gift to us, Mr. Sutherland," the pastor said. "Who are we to question the form in which it comes?" When Takoda arrived to guide Yates to the Apache camp, he brought with him traditional clothing for the ceremony, a fringed buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, and leggings to match. The gesture symbolized Ehawee's family's acceptance of him into their culture, just as his ranch represented his offering of a place in his world to her. The journey south took 2 days, during which Takoda proved to be an unexpectedly engaging companion. The young warrior had initially seemed reserved, but as they traveled, he opened up, sharing stories of his and Ehawee's childhood adventures and asking thoughtful questions about Yates's life before Montana. Ehawee says you fought in the Great War between the white men, Takoda said as they made camp on the first night, yet you do not speak of it. Some memories are better left undisturbed, Yates replied, poking at their small fire. I did what I had to do like many men of my generation. But it's not a time I care to revisit. Takoda nodded in understanding. My grandfather fought against the Mexican soldiers when he was young. He too kept his war stories locked in his heart. He said that to speak of killing gives power to death, and a warrior should instead give power to life. Your grandfather was a wise man, Yates said, impressed by the insight. That's a philosophy I can respect. They reached the Apache camp in the late afternoon of the second day. It was larger than Yates had expected, perhaps 40 lodges arranged in a rough circle around a central gathering area. Children played among the dwellings while women worked at cooking fires or tanning hides. Warriors sat in groups, some maintaining weapons, others engaged in games of chance. Activity paused briefly as Yates rode in beside Takoda, curious eyes turning to assess the white stranger. But the welcome was surprisingly warm once his identity became known. Word of Ehawee's betrothal had clearly spread throughout the camp, and while some regarded him with understandable caution, others greeted him with genuine interest and acceptance. Chief Tall Pine emerged from a large lodge at the northern edge of the camp, raising a hand in greeting. Yates Sutherland, he called. Welcome to our home. You arrive at a good time. The preparations are complete. Before Yates could respond, the flap of the lodge opened again, and Ehawee stepped out. She was dressed differently than he had seen her before, in a dress of soft white buckskin elaborately decorated with beadwork, shells, and fringe. Her hair had been arranged in intricate braids interwoven with small white flowers, and around her neck hung a ceremonial necklace of polished stones and silver. She was breathtaking. Yates felt his heart swell at the sight of her, all the doubts and challenges they faced seeming insignificant in the face of the connection they shared. As custom dictated, he did not approach her directly, but was instead led to a separate lodge where he would prepare for the ceremony scheduled for the following dawn. Takoda and 2 other young men of the tribe stayed with him, explaining the rituals he would participate in and helping him don the traditional clothing they had brought. That night, unable to sleep despite the long journey, Yates sat outside his temporary dwelling, gazing up at the vast canopy of stars overhead. The camp had quieted, only the occasional cry of a night bird or the soft murmur of voices from distant fires breaking the silence. A movement caught his attention, a slender figure approaching through the shadows. As she drew closer, he recognized Ehawee, though protocol suggested they should remain separate until the ceremony. You should not be here, he said softly, though he couldn't suppress his smile at the sight of her. Some traditions are meant to be honored, she replied, settling beside him but maintaining a proper distance. Others are meant to be adjusted according to circumstance. Yates chuckled. I'm beginning to think your reputation for wisdom includes a healthy dose of strategic rule bending. Only when necessary, Ehawee assured him with a playful glint in her eye. I wanted to be sure you were prepared for tomorrow. The ceremony will include elements that may be unfamiliar to you. Takoda has been explaining them, Yates said. I'll do my best to honor them properly. Ehawee nodded, her expression turning more serious. There is one thing he may not have mentioned. After we are joined, we will need to decide where to make our primary home. My father has offered us a place here with the band, or we can return to your ranch. The choice should be made together. Yates considered this. He had assumed they would live at the ranch, but he realized that assumption came from his own cultural perspective. What would you prefer? He asked. I have thought much about this, Ehawee admitted. I believe we could build something special at your ranch, a place that is neither fully Apache nor fully white, but something new, a bridge between worlds. My skills as a healer could serve both our peoples there, and any children we might have would learn to navigate both cultures from the beginning. The thought of children of a family with Ehawee sent a wave of emotion through Yates that caught him by surprise. "I would like that," he said, his voice thick. "Very much." Ehawee's smile was radiant in the starlight. "Then it is decided, but we will visit my people regularly and they will always be welcome in our home." "Of course," Yates agreed. "Your family will be my family too." She rose gracefully. "I should go before Nahimana realizes I've slipped away. My sister takes her duties as my attendant very seriously." "Until tomorrow, then," Yates said, resisting the urge to reach for her hand. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, "when our paths become one." The wedding ceremony took place as promised at dawn, as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky with gold and pink. The entire camp gathered in a large circle, with Chief Tall Pine at its head. Yates stood to his right, dressed in the traditional clothing provided for him, his heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. A drum began to beat, its rhythm slow and steady like a heartbeat. From the opposite side of the circle, Ehawee appeared, led by Nahimana and Kimimla. She looked even more beautiful than the previous day, her face serene yet joyful as their eyes met across the gathering. The ceremony itself was both simpler and more profound than Yates had anticipated. There were no lengthy recitations or complex rituals. Instead, Chief Tall Pine spoke briefly about the meaning of marriage in their culture, the joining not just of two people but of two spirits, two families, two traditions that would now flow together like rivers merging into a greater whole. Ehawee and Yates were then led to stand before him, where they exchanged simple promises in both Apache and English. Yates had practiced his Apache vows diligently under Takota's guidance, and though his pronunciation was imperfect, the sincerity behind his words was unmistakable. The final element of the ceremony involved the exchange of gifts. Ehawee presented Yates with a woven sash of intricate design, symbolizing her commitment to walk beside him through all seasons. In return, Yates gave her the gold band he had purchased, explaining its meaning in his culture as an endless circle representing unbroken commitment. As Ehawee slipped the ring onto her finger, her eyes met his with such deep understanding and affection that words became unnecessary. Chief Tall Pine placed his hands on their joined ones, offering a final blessing before declaring them united as husband and wife, according to the traditions of their people. The celebration that followed lasted throughout the day and into the night. There was feasting, music, dancing, and storytelling. Yates found himself welcomed into conversations and activities, his status as an outsider seeming to diminish with each passing hour as he became simply Ehawee's husband, a new member of their extended family. As the evening progressed, Yates and Ehawee were eventually led to a new lodge that had been prepared for them at the edge of the camp. It was smaller than the family dwellings but beautifully appointed with furs, woven blankets, and a central fire that cast a warm, intimate glow. When they were finally alone, Yates turned to Ehawee, taking her hands in his. "I feel like I've been waiting for this moment since the day I found you by that tree," he said softly. "Perhaps we have been moving toward each other for longer than we know," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "My people believe that souls recognize each other from previous journeys together." "I like that idea," Yates admitted, drawing her closer. "It would explain why being with you feels so right, so natural, despite all the reasons it shouldn't." Their first kiss as husband and wife was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more passionate. The barriers of culture and custom fell away, leaving only the universal language of love and desire that needed no translation. Later, as they lay wrapped in each other's arms beneath the soft furs, Ehawee traced lazy patterns on Yates's chest. "What are you thinking?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "About journeys," he replied. "About how the path that led me to Montana, that led me to that exact spot where you were sheltering from the storm. How unlikely it all seems, and yet how inevitable it feels now." Ehawee smiled. "That is the mystery of life, is it not? The great pattern that we can only see small pieces of until we look back over the distance we have traveled. And now we travel forward together," Yates said, kissing her forehead, "wherever the path leads." 3 days later, they began the journey back to the ranch, accompanied by Kimimla and Takoda, who would stay for a time to help them establish their new home. Nahimana chose to remain with the band, though she promised to visit when they made their seasonal camp closer to Kingston later in the year. The return to the ranch marked the beginning of their shared life, a blending of traditions and practices that evolved naturally over time. Ehawee brought with her not only her personal possessions, but knowledge and skills that complemented Yates's ranching expertise. Her understanding of local plants led to an expanded garden of both food and medicinal herbs. Her talent with leatherwork and beading supplemented their income when Yates took her crafts to sell in Kingston alongside his cattle. The reception in town was mixed, as they had expected. Some, like Pastor Thomas, accepted their marriage with open-minded grace. Others maintained a cool distance, their disapproval evident in sideways glances and whispered conversations that stopped when Yates and Ehawee approached. Martha Wilkins remained predictably disapproving, though her natural curiosity eventually overcame her prejudice enough that she began to engage Ehawee in conversation when they visited the store. Her initial stiff formality gradually gave way to a reluctant respect, especially after Ehawee successfully treated the shopkeeper's chronic headaches with a herbal remedy. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the ranch flourished under their combined care. The cabin expanded with the addition of a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. The garden yielded abundant harvests. The cattle grew fat on the rich grasses of the Montana summer. But the greatest joy came with the first snowfall of their shared winter, when Ehawee confirmed what Yates had begun to suspect: she was carrying their child. "A spring baby," she told him, her eyes shining with happiness as she placed his hand over her still flat stomach. "He or she will arrive with the new growth, the season of beginnings." Yates felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "I never thought I would have this," he admitted, his voice rough with feeling. "A wife, a child, a true home. You've given me more than I ever dared to hope for." "We have given these things to each other," Ehawee corrected gently. "And we will continue to build this life together, day by day, season by season." As winter settled over Kingston once more, they found themselves reflecting on the storm that had brought them together exactly 1 year before. They stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, Yates's arm around Ehawee's shoulders as they watched snowflakes swirl in the gathering dusk. "I was thinking," Yates said, "about that night when I found you, about the blanket." Ehawee looked up at him questioningly. "It was just a horse blanket," he continued. "Nothing special, but giving it to you that night, it was the first truly unselfish thing I'd done in a long time. And somehow, that small act of kindness brought me the greatest gift of my life." Ehawee smiled, leaning into his embrace. "In my culture, we believe that every act of generosity creates a circle that eventually returns to the giver. Your blanket kept me alive through that night, but what you truly offered was respect and dignity when many would have seen only difference. And in return, I got you, Yates said, kissing the top of her head. And soon, our child, I'd say that circle of giving came back around with interest. As if in agreement, the baby chose that moment to kick, causing Ehawee to laugh and place Yates's hand over the spot. Already strong like both parents, she said proudly. They stood together a moment longer, watching as the snow continued to fall, transforming the landscape just as love had transformed their lives. From a chance encounter in a winter storm had grown a bond that bridged cultures, healed old wounds, and promised a future neither could have imagined alone. When the cold finally drove them inside, they moved toward the warmth of their hearth, their home, their shared life a testament to the power of one small act of kindness and the unexpected paths it can reveal.